Good afternoon, and welcome to another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions. This is Michael Cross, and I got a really great show tonight. But before I get started, since we're going to be talking about psychopaths, I would encourage people to visit my website at michaelcross.net, where that's a big topic of discussion. So anyway, tonight we are privileged to have a guest, Professor Scott Lilienfeld. And you're from Emory, correct?
That's correct. Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia.
Okay, all right. See a lot of Atlanta, Georgia when I tune into The Walking Dead.
Yes, that's where we're based, exactly.
Okay, well, as long as there's no zombies out there.
Oh, last I checked, I haven't seen any in the streets. I think we're fine.
Great. Hey, I was reading some articles a while back, and I came across some interesting stuff that you had written, or had been written about you, in reference to, of all things, psychopathic heroism. And, well, can you just kind of tell the viewers, I mean, most of them probably think that a hero is the antithesis of a psychopath. And, well, is that true, or is it something that maybe is a little bit more complex?
Well, we're actually not sure ourselves, to be honest, and I think I'm a bit of two minds about this. So you're right, we've done some work on it. I wouldn't say it's conclusive, but it stems from some speculations, actually, from my late PhD advisor at the University of Minnesota, a man by the name of David Lykken, Lykken, and David speculated, really more based on clinical conjecture than any data, that there is some kind of link between psychopathy and heroism. He actually said in his typical literary way that the psychopath and the hero are twigs off the same branch. And his reasoning there is that he viewed the core trait in psychopathy to be fearlessness, sort of a lack of fear, which often gets them in trouble. So we're accustomed to people not having enough fear doing bad things, which they often do. They may end up robbing banks and hurting people and taking unnecessary risks and driving drunk and things like that. But he argued that there's a flip side of that coin, whereby a lack of fear may in some cases also give rise to certain kinds of pro-social behaviors, such as heroic behaviors, that may be facilitated by a lack of fear. So that's kind of what got us interested in that issue. I think some of it depends on how you define heroism. We can maybe get into that, but we wanted to look at the possibility that in some cases people with at least some psychopathic traits, particularly the traits relevant to fearlessness, might actually predispose people toward engaging in behaviors that society at least would regard as heroic.
Okay. In fiction, we have characters such as Superman or James Bond. Do they show what you call the fearless dominance? Yeah,
so Bond certainly does. Superman in some ways does too. I guess depends on whether he's Superman or Clark Kent, I suppose, right? But James Bond certainly showed that constellation of traits that we call. Actually, my colleague and friend Chris Patrick at Florida State University coined that term, along with Stephen Benning, fearless dominance, which we see as a constellation of traits very relevant to psychopathy, psychopathic personality. So people high in fearless dominance, as you can probably tell by the name, are often physically fearless. They often seek adventure. They're often risk-taking. They often are socially dominant, as you can tell by the name. They're often socially potent. They make a very good first impression. They're often strong leaders. And also they tend to be relatively immune to stress and anxiety. They tend to be quite resilient in the face of stress. But not everyone agrees with us on this. But according to our model, those are traits that often can lead people to get into trouble in some cases. And there's some data that's showing that they may be linked to certain kinds of problematic behaviors like fraud and maybe some kinds of crimes. And they're often also related to high racial behaviors in some cases. But we also think that those behaviors can lead to, or at least be associated with, certain positive outcomes, as we see in James Bond.
Well, one of the traits that, like Harry's psychopathic checklist, is based. Well, you already talked about wanting kind of an adventure, they tend to get bored, but also the aspect of not really wanting to follow social convention. In other words, I guess they're like nonconformist. You'd say that's correct?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's probably true that people with psychopathy tend to be somewhat nonconformist. We actually have a scale on our test. We have a self-report measure of psychopathy, and one of the scales on it we actually call rebellious nonconformity. And they often flaunt social conventions, flout social conventions, and don't care much about what people think about them, and are very happy to do things that are anti-authoritarian. Some of that may be because they're angry and are alienated from society. It may also be because they don't really care much about what people think about them, and are quite happy to do as they please, and are not worried about social disapproval.
So maybe that could explain situations. I mean, we always find these horrible stories about someone getting mugged in the street and just people standing around until someone rushes out to the aid of the person. And I guess that would be someone who doesn't care about just kind of blending in and not jumping out and doing something. So maybe that being a psychopath could have a plus there.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's some older data way back when. I haven't seen it replicated, reproduced recently, although I'm not sure anyone's looked at it, but I believe looking at predictors of helping in emergency situations. And if I recall correctly, there were a couple of studies suggesting that people who are nonconformist are often more likely to help in those situations, partly because they aren't as concerned about making a fool of themselves or doing what other people expect them to do. So you're right that in a lot of these situations, what you see, and there's classic work on this going back to the work of two psychologists, Darley and Latney, here in the U.S. back in the 60s and 70s, what you often see in these situations is that a lot of people stand around and don't do anything when there's an emergency. And there are a couple of reasons for that, but one reason is that people often, one reason certainly is that people are scared and they're afraid of taking risks. Another reason is that people often are putting responsibility on other people. They don't feel as much personal responsibility to do anything. And it may also be true that social norms, expectations play a role in intervening. So if no one is doing something, you may feel inhibited because you might feel stupid or foolish to break through that veil of conformity.
So that seems like it might be even a trait that would go into leadership. I mean, a lot of times people don't like to speak in front of people. They certainly don't want to take a risk of being under scrutiny if they, I don't know, run for political office or something. It seems like that that could actually be one of the reasons why there's a lot of speculation that psychopathy tends to be higher in politics then.
Yeah, that's right. That's one speculation. I don't think there are a lot of data showing that's true. So one thing you'll quickly discover if you start reading the literature on psychopathic personality is that there's a lot of clinical lore and a lot of speculation, but not a lot of data. And it may be true. I think it's tricky because it could very well be that there's an optimal dose of some of these traits. So you might, for a good leader, you might want to be somewhat fearless, and certainly you want to be dominant. It's very hard to get elected president of the U.S., certainly if you're not a dominant person and someone who is fairly socially fearless and willing to take on controversial issues. On the other hand, it could be that if it's too much of a good thing is a bad thing. And it could be that if those traits become too extreme, that will result in negative behaviors because fearlessness may very quickly merge into recklessness and carelessness when it gets too high.
So if you go by scale, the 0 to 40 points that person can get on the hair checklist, someone that's a 40 might take too many risks, whereas someone who's maybe a 20 to 25 or 30 might have the brakes to not go and do something dumb then.
Yeah, it's possible. The one thing I'd say is that it probably is not a single scale, the psychopathy checklist, because it looks like what we call psychopathy is very multidimensional. There are many dimensions underlying it. So with the PCLR, the psychopathy checklist revised, which some listeners might know, if they don't, I can explain it. It's sort of the most widely used measure of psychopathy in prison and other forensic settings. It looks like it's actually measuring several different things. So it's a little hard to know, but I think your instincts, I think, are right. There may be some truth to what you're saying. And I think I would say is if there's a measure, say, of fearlessness or low anxiety, you might see the kind of pattern you're describing. Now, we've looked at that in some of our data. We occasionally find hints of that tendency, where if it gets too extreme, bad things happen, but I would not say it's entirely consistent. But I think there's some maybe better research designs one could use to look at that.
Okay. Yeah, so essentially, if you're taking a look at the term impulsive aggressiveness and so forth, essentially that's just kind of a scientific term for boldness, isn't it?
Well, it turns out actually it's a bit different. So there's a separate dimension that comes out of some psychopathy measures. Impulsive antisociality, we call it self-centered impulsivity, but I think it's a fairly similar trait. So oddly enough, it is largely independent of boldness, at least in our data. It may be a little bit correlated, so it may be a very slight positive correlation, but it looks as though they're two somewhat different systems. And according to some models, what we call psychopathy may be a confluence of both of those dimensions. That is, to be a sort of classical prototypical psychopath, you might need to be someone who's very disinhibited, which is more of that impulsive antisocial dimension you're referring to. You might be someone who has very poor impulse control. You might be someone who is reckless. You might be someone who doesn't think much before they do things. People with those traits also sometimes tend to be callous and unempathic. And again, to be more of a classical psychopath, you might also need to be high in that fearless dominance component as well. You might be someone who's charming and dominant and fearless. So it may be those two sets of traits in conjunction that comprises psychopathy, although that's still a controversial issue.
Okay, speaking of controversial issues, would you say that this is something that is entirely genetic, a combination of genes and environment for expression? What causes psychopathy?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think one thing I would say is everything that psychologists have looked at in the personality realm, including psychopathy, is certainly a mixture of nature and nurture. So we know from twin studies that there is definitely a heritable component. Whether or not it is a heritable component to psychopathy itself, which I'm inclined to doubt, as opposed to personality traits that are themselves related to psychopathy, is a separate question. I think probably what we're seeing is it's unlikely there's a genetic component to psychopathy per se, but there are certainly genetic influences on the traits that go along with psychopathy, like lack of fear and poor impulse control and being callous and so on. But there's also a big environmental component. But getting to your question, we don't know what it is. That problem is in most of these studies, not to get too technical, but in most of these studies, the environment is more or less defined by exclusion. That is, we can look at twin studies and say, yeah, there's a heritable element to these traits, and then the environment is whatever's left over. But we do not know what those environmental influences are. So some people have speculated, for example, that parenting practices may play some role in psychopathy. I suspect they do, and it could very well be that having if you're a fearless child, and other people, including my PhD mentor David Licken, have argued this. If you're a very, very fearless child, and you have a parent who isn't very good, you may end up becoming a criminal later. Whereas if you're a fearless child, but you have a parent who instills in you a sense of pride and it's a good role model and teaches you how to channel those traits into something constructive, you might end up being a politician instead of a criminal. Of course, you could be both. But parenting some of those traits are channeled. Now, I'm not sure that parenting plays as much a role in changing the traits themselves, but they may play a big role in what avenues individuals with those traits go down.
Ah, that's very interesting indeed. Now, one other thing I want to address here is in your research. Some people believe, for instance, and you'll see this on social media and stuff whenever the topic psychopaths come up, that psychopaths have no empathy whatsoever, whereas I've heard also the theory that they're just very good at repressing it and letting it come out whenever they want to. What's your take on that?
Well, that's a good question, and I think it's a complex question. I'd answer it in a couple of ways. So number one, I think virtually nothing in psychology is all or none. So I don't think I think someone who claims that psychopathic individuals have no empathy, I think it's going beyond the data, and I think it's very unlikely because there probably are some people with very, very extreme psychopathic traits who have no empathy, but almost always in psychology, and this is no exception, we're talking about gradation. So what we typically in psychopathy we see in these individuals is that there's a diminution in empathy, and there's less than one sees in other people. It's also, though, important to understand that empathy itself is not one thing. So there's a good deal of psychological literature suggesting that there's a big difference between cognitive empathy, thinking empathy, which is more the ability to put yourself in the shoes of another person, and more affective empathy, which is sometimes called sympathy, which is the ability to feel the states of another person. You might think those go together closely, but oftentimes they do not. They're actually two quite different traits. So most evidence suggests, although even here it's mixed, and the psychopathy field is often confusing in this way, but I would say the bulk of the evidence, with some exceptions, suggests that psychopathic individuals are probably fairly intact in cognitive empathy. They're often good at putting themselves in the shoes of another person, or maybe as good as you and I would be. But they are deficient in affective empathy. That is, they don't feel the feeling states of other people. But again, even there, I think it's likely that we're talking about a continuum or dimension rather than an all or none phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. So in other words, a psychopathic individual could be a very caring husband and father or wife and mother, but it would only be for a very small circle of people. Maybe out in the regular world, they're kind of like a lion.
Well, I think that's right. I think that some people, I think Peter Singer's talked about this in terms of all of our circles of empathy differ, and they differ undoubtedly over time. We all have circles of empathy to which our empathy extends. And I suspect that you're right, that in psychopathic individuals, they may in some cases have empathy, but their circle may be much more limited. It may extend to people in their family or close friends, but it may not extend much far beyond that. So many of us, when we're watching a news story on television, we may get indignant or upset when we see people starving, people who are displaced by a natural disaster or war. That may make us feel terrible and make us feel indignant and feel bad about people who are suffering, who we don't know. With psychopathy, you may be less likely to see that because their circle of empathy may be much more limited to people they know well, and then perhaps more cynically in some cases, people who can benefit them directly.
Just for fun, have you ever considered which presidents in history might be the ones that show high levels of psychopathy, but also the positive trait too of heroism and fearless dominance?
Well, we have a bit of data on that. So we published a study in our lab, which is not perfect, but it got a bit of attention. A study in which expert historians who knew each president well, most of these were expert biographers on each president, rated each U.S. president on a number of personality traits using some detailed questionnaires. And from those questionnaires, we were able to extract pretty good estimates of those traits I was talking about earlier, fearless dominance and impulsive antisociality, which we now call self-centered impulsivity. So we have some data on that. I wouldn't say it's conclusive, but there were some presidents who did get quite high scores. So that for, I don't know how much Swedish listeners know about U.S. presidents, but presidents who scored among the highest were LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. LBJ was one of the highest scorers. Andrew Jackson was a very, very high scorer. And what they were high in both fearless dominance and impulsive antisociality. So they were high in both of those dimensions. An interesting counterpoint to that was Theodore Roosevelt, who was very high in fearless dominance, but not elevated in the other aspects of psychopathy. So at least according to our model, he would not be regarded as a classic psychopath. So he was very dominant. He would suck the air out of a room. He was a very powerful person socially, very influential, but he was also very conscientious and was a person with good impulse control who treated, by and large, other people well. So in some ways, maybe that's kind of the ideal mix for a politician, someone who has those traits, just a moderate dose of those traits, but also has good impulse control and knows how to temper those traits appropriately. In the U.S. right now, we're just beginning to get started with our presidential elections, and there are lots of people running on both sides, and that's, I think, something for people to look for. There's a lot of controversy in the U.S., and I'm sure there is in Europe too, about whether personality should matter in selecting a president. I'm inclined to think it should matter a bit. I'm not sure it should be the overriding factor. I think sometimes in the U.S. it matters too much. I think we focus too much on personalities, but I think it should matter a bit. And I think one thing we need to look for is someone maybe who is does have some gumption and some oomph and some ability to go against the grain when necessary. Fearless dominance may be one, not the only, but maybe one way of accomplishing that. So you want someone who can be dominant and who can be strong, but also you need someone who shows good judgment, and that's really where the other dimension comes in. Someone who can inhibit their impulses, because I'm sure when you're president, I'm sure feel like slamming down the phone a lot when you're talking to people both inside and outside of your country. So you need someone who knows when to modulate those traits appropriately.
And one who's read Machiavelli a lot.
That probably helps a little bit too. That's right.
Hey, one last question. I know your schedule's pretty tight here, but one last question. I know that narcissism is something that overlaps into psychopathy, but some people show more psychopathy, some people show more narcissism. If you were electing, if you were able to see the person, do a personality evaluation on candidates that are running for office, don't need to mention any right now in the United States, and you had one that tended to score a little higher on psychopathy, but another one that scored a little higher on narcissism, which one would you want to choose?
Well, yeah, that's a hard question. Of course, we have no narcissism among U.S. politicians. We've never seen that before. So it's hard to say because, again, I think I see so I'll answer it in a somewhat indirect way, partly because I think what we're talking about with both psychopathy and narcissism are nations of different traits. I don't see them as, and again, some people disagree with us on that, but I and my colleagues typically don't see them as one trait. I think they're different blends of traits. So what I would say is if I were looking for someone, I think I would look for someone who is not necessarily narcissistic, but someone who has certainly high self-esteem and is someone who is able and willing to take appropriate risks and is socially self-confident, but also can temper those traits appropriately. So I think there are different little bits and pieces of psychopathy and narcissism in there. But I think what you see in psychopathy and narcissism classically is that those traits are taken to a great extreme. Now, narcissism itself, I should also point out, not to make it even more complicated, narcissism itself is pretty multidimensional too. It looks like there's a kind of grandiose dimension underlying a lot of narcissism. So there's some narcissistic traits that are characterized by being very braggadocious and flamboyant and so on. And other traits that are more marked by being vulnerable and touchy and having a thin skin. And what we found in a separate study, again, it's only the U.S. presidents and how much it generalizes beyond the U.S. And also beyond presidents we don't know. But we did find is that the grandiose blend of narcissism, again, the type of narcissism that's more characterized by being kind of braggadocious and flamboyant and extremely extroverted is a bit of a double-edged sword. So it's related to both some good leadership abilities. It's good at being perceived as a strong leader, but it's also related to a somewhat increased risk for certain unethical behaviors. So what I would say is if we're electing someone who's extremely narcissistic, we better watch out, because that person may be at somewhat higher risk for doing some bad things, even though they may be perceived as a strong leader. So that may be a risk that maybe we're taking in some cases, but it's one would have to think deeply about. I should also point out that vulnerable narcissism was not related to much good at all. So we weren't able to find much that was related positively. That was a good leadership trait that was associated with vulnerable narcissism. So if someone's extremely touchy, thin-skinned, that may be a set of traits one to look for, at least in the president.
Okay. Excellent. Hey, do you have a website listeners can visit?
Well, no, I don't really. I do have a departmental website, but I don't have any fancy websites. But if they Google me, they can certainly see a lot of my writing on psychopathy. If you just Google my name and psychopathy, a lot of stuff will pop up in both the popular and academic literature.
Excellent. I'm sure that'd be very interesting for people to study here. Okay, well, we're out of time here. So thank you, Scott, for sharing.
My pleasure.
Hello there, and welcome to the second half of Unlock the Door Radio with your host, Michael Cross here. Hey, before I go on, I just want to encourage people again to go to my YouTube station at Michael Cross and subscribe, and also check out my website at michaelcross.net. I can't promise that the stuff you'll read there is easy and non-controversial, but if you want to read something interesting, be my guest. Come and visit at michaelcross.net. Now, what I want to deal with in the next 30 minutes is the idea that the media has a stranglehold over the public. That's right, a stranglehold. I'm using this analogy. I think I'll use a YouTube. I'll make this into a YouTube broadcast later. The thing is that it is truly a stranglehold, because for much of the public, this is where they get all their information. And although alternative radio, such as what you're listening to right now, is providing a different means by which people can get information, it's still crucial to get into the public mind. And to get into the public mind, you've got to go through the filter that's created by 6 mega corporations. That's right, 6. If you go to the PBS website and look up the Merchants of Cool Media Corporations, and this is over a 10-year-old broadcast, it's consolidated more since then. There are 6 corporations that pretty much control everything that people read, literature, the movies they watch, as well as the news they listen to nightly. And so it's very crucial to understand how they manipulate us and how they maintain this stranglehold over us as a nation. Now, what I'd like to do is just kind of jump right in here and basically point out that you'll never get anything out there that's non-biased. Okay? It's impossible. As Orwell stated, all art is propaganda. And propaganda, as Edward Bernays pointed out, is not necessarily false, but it is designed to get you to think a certain way. So yes, all art, and I will include in that, all broadcast, anything someone says. I mean, when you're talking to someone, you look at the way their eyes are. You look at their facial expressions. Why? Because you want to find out if what they're saying matches what they are conveying in other nonverbal ways. And so if you don't trust your best friend, your spouse, your children, to be telling you something that is totally 100% true, then why do you trust someone that's paid millions of dollars to sit in front of a teleprompter and read off the news to you? And even more than that, even though they may have that nice, trustworthy face, okay, looks like a middle-aged mannequin from the 1950s, the thing is, they're not the ones making the news story. They're just reading it off. And if they are commentators, they still have to deal with the people that actually write their paychecks. So it's all a process of manipulation that you have to understand. Okay, but here's just a few little things I thought were interesting in regards to how you could actually, and, with the 2016 elections coming up, this is very crucial to keep in mind. But it's not just American politics. I think every country does this to a large degree if it has any kind of free press. How they get you to think a certain way. How they get into your mind and kind of squish it around and get what they want to come through. Now, one of the things I think is one of the most important things is they can create irrelevance. And that's through a case in point would be a situation like, well, think about Ron Paul. The former congressman from Texas. The media generally ignored everything he had to say. They didn't, if they wanted to cover someone that was maybe anti-war, but they were coming from a more conservative perspective, you don't want to show that. If you want to have a nice little war in Iraq or Afghanistan or any number of other places the United States is bombing people in, then you want to frame the issue in such a way that, okay, you got your left-wing person who's a mainstream left-wing, and you've got your right-wing person who's mainstream, if they do show both sides. And then you have your debate. Now, I'll get into the dynamics of that in just a moment a little bit more, but you usually never see someone like Ron Paul, or on more of a left perspective, Noam Chomsky in the American press, in the mainstream American press being covered. And that's because you want to keep a certain amount of control over the message. So it has to be very, very compatible with the sensibilities of the elite. So if you've got a very liberal newspaper, but it also is connected in some ways to the government and the military-industrial complex and so forth, then it may come out and question in a nice way whether the United States should intervene in a conflict, but ultimately it will support that intervention. And most people don't realize that. It's almost like they sit back and like, oh, well, this newspaper is really this, and, criticize this a little bit. Let's question it. But let's go along with it ultimately. No, that counts for surveillance of the population by the government, all kinds of issues, GMOs. But anyway, ignore a story or ignore a person. You're kind of seeing this with the presidential campaign right now. Donald Trump, he's out there in the front. Why? Because he has a certain level of entertainment credibility established over the years, plus he has lots of money. It seemed earlier that Jeb Bush was the favorite of the establishment. Kind of a, part of that same dynasty. Let's have a Clinton-Bush campaign and see which one wins. Well, who cares which one wins, because ultimately they're going to have the same policies in the important stuff, economics, military, and so forth. They may differ a little bit on some social issues, but not terribly. But the thing is, Rand Paul, who has a very conservative stance on many issues, libertarian conservative, economic conservative, but coupled with let's not be intervening in every single country on earth. Let's not be surveying people like some, sort of modern East German Stasi state. Well, let's ignore him. Let's not give him a lot of publicity. Maybe throw in Rubio. Yeah, he's the third person in the whole equation. But the thing is, ultimately, the media filters, okay? It filters who is considered a viable candidate. It filters what issues people are supposed to pay attention to. Right, lately, it's Cecil the Lion. We've got to pay lots of attention to Cecil. Now, of course, we don't hear a lot about, I don't know, let's throw something in that same country, Africa. I've been to Africa before, okay? I've looked at the statistics of how many people die of malaria. I took every single precaution I could when I was in Central Africa to make sure I was never bitten by a mosquito. I mean, probably wound up putting all kinds of carcinogens in me by covering myself with a multitude of insect repellents. But the thing is, that is something that the media doesn't cover that much. Malaria, used to be HIV was covered a lot. Now it's not. I mean, it's not, just not big newsworthy stuff. And most people think, well, I guess it just doesn't exist. It's like herpes. Herpes, 15 years ago, lots of coverage of herpes in the United States and how many people go to singles bars and stuff with herpes. And now it's not covered hardly at all. So I guess it must have been cured. No, it's just the media is not paying attention to it, so it's not an issue in most people's minds. But, Cecil the Lion, huge issue, okay? Now, I have friends that are vegan, okay? I am not a vegan. But they quite correctly point out that if you are really worried about, one lion getting, allegedly poached, then maybe you should be worried about all the tens of millions of animals that are locked up in factory farms getting fattened up and ready for slaughter. Okay? I mean, think about all the cats and dogs put to sleep every day. All right? But you know what? It gets different when the media says, well, this is the big issue. It's just like Bruce Jenner, big issue. Let's not worry about what's going on in Syria, okay? What the U.S. government is doing there. I don't know how much detail I'm willing to go by just yet, but that the U.S. government under Obama is saying that if the so-called Free Syrian rebels, okay, I mean, you can study that group and find out where they're coming from. If they're being, if they're in a fight with the Syrian military, then the U.S. government might go in and bomb the Syrian military. Well, the Syrian military is actually fighting ISIS, okay? So it seems kind of weird, but that you're going to be bombing the people that are fighting ISIS. In the same way, Turkey, bombing the Kurds, it seems a little bit strange. But hey, there's other things we're supposed to worry about. Cecil, Bruce, all kinds of other things. And the media will tell us what is important. Go to their websites. Go to the network websites and check the front stories and see what really is important in their minds. Oh, come on. I mean, really. I mean, if you consider all the major, you compare alternative media to network media, it's ridiculous. But anyway, create irreverence through ignoring. Of course, a lot of times they just ignore alternative media. The other thing that's very important when it comes to the elections and anything in general is the technique of choosing what pictures to use of candidates. In other words, if you're in favor of someone, show very flattering pictures. If you're against them, that people will remember pictures. The whole thing about a picture is worth 1,000 words. Try to use pictures that will show the person you're against as being kind of crazy, maybe. show, you know, I just remembered something here. When I was at the Republican National Convention in 1988, we noticed, delegates would notice which delegates got interviewed by the national media. Who would get the interviews from the reporters from ABC, NBC, CBS, or whatever. And you pretty much noticed very early on the rule of the crazy hat. That's right. Rule of the crazy hat. If you had a crazy hat with all kinds of weird stuff on it, it was preferable, since it's a Republican convention, that you ignore the young people and you zero in on the elderly woman, maybe 70 years old, with really funny looking hair and a crazy hat. They were the ones that got interviewed all the time. And this gave an image, kind of like very exotic, and that's a nice way of putting it. People who were old white women with crazy hats. And that would be the symbol of what the Republican Party was all about. You ignore all the other, the younger people. At the time, I was amongst the youngest elected delegates to the convention and never got interviewed by the national media, which was really quite interesting. But I noticed the same thing was true of younger men and women that were there. Or if you were non-white, it seemed like they didn't want to interview you either. So they create a perception. The story is already written before you get an interview take place. Okay, the media does not operate on the assumption or the rule that they are going to interview some people and find out what's going on. They already know what the story is. They're trying to confirm it. Okay, and I've got plenty of experience with the media that would say that yes, that is what the story's about. So, you also have other examples. I'm not going to just use the Republicans. I've noticed that whenever you do have a story that does miraculously appear in the mainstream media about GMOs, okay? And, whether GMOs are safe or not, that's a big debate right now, but come on. Why not label them? But anyway, if you have a protest, what they will do, at least I've kind of noticed this, is find some hippie type person with dreadlocks and interview them. Now, what does that do for the people that are out there watching this? Oh, look, look at the people, the hippies out there that let them just go to organic stores. I don't want to pay more for my corn chips or my ice cream or my vegetables or my whatever. You see, sometimes you can actually shut the news, turn the volume off and watch it, and you'll be able to tell what the story is by just watching the pictures. And they're the ones in charge. And when they have hours of footage and they only show a minute or two, or even less, of an event, then that's a lot of power to mold the people's minds. Okay. Now, other techniques. Oh, well, here's a good one. Demonize an opponent. Make them look bad. Any of you that are wanting Donald Trump to get elected, you kind of know what that's all about, don't you? How the media is going to make you look really, really bad. But I'm thinking about this. Listen to this headline here. This is great. Now remember, Cecil the Lion, okay? Think about Cecil and how the media really cares about protecting wildlife. Here is how the words here in this sentence come across, or title. This is from the December 15th, 2014 UK Mail Online. And it says, Putin's tiger continues its killing spree. Beast released into wild by Russian president now filmed feasting on a pet dog, dog is all capitalized, D-O-G, as it terrorizes Chinese villages. That's kind of interesting. I've seen so many things written about let's preserve endangered wildlife. Okay? Now, remember too, most people when they're looking through a publication, and I've had media people tell me this all the time, they read the title and look at the picture. And if they go beyond that, they read the first paragraph, maybe the second. But very few people read the full story. So, you think about that title. Putin's tiger continues its killing spree? What do tigers do? What do lions do? What did Cecil do? Cecil ate zebras. Cecil ate baby wildebeest and baby giraffes. And if lucky, a baby elephant. Okay? Well, tigers do the same thing. They're just like your little pussycat. Your pussycat, if it was as big as a tiger, would be eating you. Instead of just going out and creating environmental havoc on, the local bird and squirrel and reptile population. But yet, you never consider that. The thing about the cats is, you never see stories about that, do you? You know why? Because the media knows if it runs an article about cats and their damage to wildlife, native wildlife in a region, someone goes out, they move into a new area, they hear birds chirping all over, and then a few people bring their cats in, in the neighborhood, and you don't hear birds chirping as much anymore. Okay, why is that? Because the cats eat the bird, well, they at least kill the birds and stuff like, and do those kinds of things. Now, the thing is, you don't want to have a story like that because, oh my gosh, you're going to get all the especially middle-aged women with cats freaking out, like, how dare you, and switch off the news. So you never see stories about that, do you? Why do I come into... Well, it used to be that there was all kinds of wildlife, and now there isn't. It must be pollution. Well, it could also be lots of cats taking care of the local wildlife, and that sort of thing. But just think about that. Putin puts a lot of money into saving animals in Russia that are endangered. That's right. The Russian government puts a lot of money into those sorts of things. If the Russian government didn't do that, the media would be saying how bad the Russians were in allowing the destruction of the native habitat and destruction of the animals. But no, the Russian government puts a lot of money and efforts into saving these endangered species. But then again, Putin is supposed to be the bad guy according to the media. The media wants you to believe that Putin's terrible. They show pictures of Putin looking aggressive. They show they have headlines that will, even beyond, his ravenous, destructive tiger that's out there. Sounds like something from the tiger in the Jungle Book. Trying to get, I forget what the little kid's name was. And everything in the Jungle Book. But the thing is that you will make sure that you make the person look bad. And if you do it enough, you repeat a story more and more and more and more and more, it gets forged in people's minds. In fact, if you do see something written about Putin, or a number of other leaders for that matter, but if you see something written about Putin, and someone responds to it, they always, I think, feel like they have to put something in saying, well, he's got his problems, and I'm not a Putin supporter, but he's doing good things here and here and here. So you see, you create a situation in which it's socially, it's just not socially acceptable to actually for someone to come out and say, hey, Putin's a great guy, or Putin's doing a good job for his country. No, you've got to make sure that the narrative is that he's either evil or he's a bad guy, at least. But you can never put, and then you've got to make it sound as if the Russian people are all misguided and propagandized, or they would see through him. Okay? Well, but that gives you an example here. You use the words, most of the time you won't have this kind of headline, but it'll be similar. And words convey a meaning. Just choosing a different word, like the word leadership and manipulation, means the same exact thing. Get someone to do something they normally wouldn't do. If you want to say something good about them, you say leader. If you want to say it bad, manipulator. Look it up. Same word. Now, speaking of repeating something over and over again, I think it's interesting that when the whole story came out of the possible use of poison gas by the Assad government, notice I didn't say regime, I said government. Very good, goes back to what I was saying about choosing words. If you repeat something more and more and more, people just accept it. Now, when it first came out, at least it was fair enough to say that, it's suspected that he used the poison gas, even though his government said they didn't do it. And there was plenty of evidence to show that it was not Assad that used gas on his own people in order to rout rebels. But if you look at the media now, it's always Assad used these chemicals on his people, like 2 years ago, 3 years ago. The thing is, it's changed from alleged, it's changed from suspected to now the media just runs with it. Okay, he used it. And so people don't ask the question, well, do you have proof? No. They just assume there must be proof because you write the story a certain way, just like with the airliner that got shot down over Ukraine. There's a whole bunch of different scenarios that could have existed, but if you just run with the narrative, okay, the Russians shot it down, and you don't explore the idea of, well, there's always a possibility Ukrainians accidentally shot it down, that it seemed to have been a missile fired from the air, which, of course, Ukrainian Air Force. Even if you threw those possibilities in, suddenly people might go, wait a minute, yeah, there is another possibility. Maybe it wasn't the Russians that did it. Well, then that destroys the entire thrust of the story as to how evil the Russians are, which the media wants you to believe. So, there's another one. Repeat a falsehood over and over and over and over until it finally becomes true. Now, there's the other technique that's interesting, I think, is the whole character assassination. And, I'm not going to deal with Putin here, but take a look at what they did to Sarah Palin back when she was running for vice president and afterwards, the last 8 years. Sarah Palin is made to look like an idiot. Okay? I would tend to think, whether you like her or hate her, she's not an idiot. And if you think about character assassination, how far it goes, think about the fact that they make her family into an issue, her daughter, and her personal life. The media make it an issue. And you know what? Because the media has a stranglehold, it seems that they don't really care. You don't have one network doing it and then maybe all the other networks saying, hey, wait a minute, that's going a little too far, or newspapers or whatever. It's just, okay, that's legitimate. Now, I'm not saying that they should turn attention on, I thought it was unfair how people used to make fun, comedians and so forth. I even saw a cartoon once that was making fun of Chelsea Clinton when she was a teenager. I think that was, wrong. She didn't choose to be in the family she was in, and she should not have been the center of controversy when she was, just a kid. And nor should Obama's kids be the focus of any kind of attacks. But neither should Sarah Palin's kids, or for that matter, Donald Trump's kids, or any other politicians. Unless, if they come out and start condemning people for something, then maybe there's a certain fairness if someone says, yeah, but what about this person's kids and that sort of thing. But I've never heard Sarah Palin get up and do that. And so why does her daughter become part of some sort of character assassination? And sometimes you just leaving things out of a story when it comes to character assassination. I'll go back to Assad, and again, I'll preface this, Assad is no Jeffersonian Democrat. But have you ever noticed how rarely the media points out that he's a trained doctor or that his government is what's protecting the religious minorities in Syria? The reason why Christians, what's left of the Jewish population perhaps, but definitely Christians, and the secular Sunni population, and of course the Shia population is supporting Assad, is because he's protected those groups. And the thing is that if you point that out to people, then they're going to be going, well, wait a minute, why are we wanting to bomb him? Why is our government wanting to bomb him? Why is our government wanting to fund people to take him out? Leave it out of the story. That's also a type of character assassination, is don't point out the good stuff about someone. And of course, like one of the easiest things is you make sure you choose photographs that make your target look dumb or evil. Let's show them with their hair messed up. Or another example. You notice whenever they deal with a story with Iran, they hardly ever, if ever, show a picture of the Iranian parliament. You usually see a picture of their top religious leaders. Now, most people, when they see people dressed in Middle Eastern, Islamic, I don't know what you really call the things on their heads and stuff like that, but the thing is, they're going to suddenly form an impression. And it's probably not going to be very positive in the United States. And, you want to make Iran look like, some sort of country that's still kind of back there in the old days. I mean, way old days. You don't show pictures of Tehran and make sure that it's a very modern city. You don't point out that the scientific developments and so forth in Iran, I think it was like 2 or 3 years ago, Iran was advancing faster in science than any other country on earth. And you're certainly not going to show a parliament in which most of the members are dressed in business suits. Because that conveys the idea that maybe they're not so primitive, that maybe they kind of are very similar to regular people like Americans. No. You don't want to get that message out. You want to make sure that they're still seen as the bad guys in the equation. So ultimately, there's so much more we could deal with. But ultimately, I think it's very, very important that we consider the power the media has and some of the things that they do in order to, change the story, so to speak. Anyway, that's all the time I have for today's episode, and I hope you'll come back next week for another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.TV.